Okay, welcome to SiliconExpert and the Compliance Map joint webinar on the changes to the conflict minerals rule in the electronics industry. I'm Laura Michael, the Marketing Manager for SiliconExpert, and I will be your host for today's event. We're so excited that you all could join us. Before I hand the presentation over to our speakers, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. First, just a quick review of today's agenda. We'll be going over the legislation updates and reporting, including the background, the current obligations, changes to the US and the EU legislation, some key challenges, and the reporting template itself. Then we'll be going into different solutions, including gathering data and evaluating and compiling reports. Finally, we will be concluding today's webinar with a brief Q&A section. Please submit your questions with the GoToWebinar control panel in the questions section, and I will be repeating the questions for our speakers to answer. We do hope to get to all of your questions, but also want to respect your time, and we'll be keeping this webinar to an hour. Any unanswered questions will be followed up offline. Lastly, today's webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will be sent a copy at the end. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ann Barr, who will be covering the legislation updates and reporting. Ann is a regulatory consultant at the Compliance Map, where she advises on the implementation of due diligence practices for conflict minerals management. Ann, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everybody. So as Laura said, I'm going to be covering the regulatory update part of the webinar. I'm going to provide a little bit of background to those of you who are new to the subject on conflict minerals legislation, and then we're going to look at current obligations and also future developments that are expected both in the US and in the EU. I'm then going to highlight the key challenges that companies face in meeting the requirements of the legislation and the key tool used by companies to gather the data that they need. So the first thing I want to talk about is why conflict minerals is an issue. So I'm going to give you a bit of background on the subject. And I've just had a bit of a problem with my mouse, so I'm just going to flick back. So just to give you some background on the issue, why is conflict minerals an issue? Well, it's been found that the trade in tin, tantalum, tungsten and gold has been funding armed groups who have been responsible for the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, these groups are often in control of mines and supply routes for these minerals, and they commit serious human rights abuses. Now, the intent of the legislation is about encouraging companies to avoid sourcing from mines that are controlled by these armed groups, and that will reduce the funds that are available to them to continue the conflict. And as a result of conflict resolution, the risk of these human rights abuses occurring will be reduced. Now, the legislation has been centred all around traceability and transparency as a means to encourage responsible trade. So current and proposed legislation is requiring companies to undertake due diligence in their supply chain and report publicly on the sourcing of the tin, tantalum, tungsten and gold that's used. So I'm now going to go into a bit more detail on the legislative requirements, and I'm going to start by looking at the US Securities and Exchange Commission final rule that was established as part of the Dodd-Frank Act. So what are the current obligations? Well, legal obligations are actually only affecting companies in the US, and the only companies who file reports with the SEC under the Exchange Act. And it's those companies whose products contain tin, tantalum, tungsten or gold that are necessary to the functionality of that product that are affected. What the rule requires is that these companies have to conduct what's called a reasonable country of origin inquiry that will determine whether the minerals originate in the DRC or adjoining countries, and they will have to disclose the results of that inquiry on Form SD, which has to be filed annually to the SEC by the 31st of May each year. So the deadline for this year is fast approaching, and that report will have to disclose sourcing for products manufactured in 2016. Now, that's the first step. Now, if as a result of your country of origin inquiry, you find that the minerals have been sourced from the DRC or adjoining countries, then you must conduct due diligence on the source and the chain of custody on the minerals, and you have to use an internationally recognized framework to do that. And then you must file with your Form SD the conflict minerals report that basically details the due diligence that you've undertaken. I'd just like to add here that this requirement to trace minerals back to source means that even if you yourself don't file these reports with the SEC, you might have to provide information on the source and chain of custody of minerals that you provide to your customers who maybe do submit to the SEC. So you have got a strong business case for being able to support conflict minerals compliance yourself. And I thought it would be useful just to talk a little bit about what the due diligence is. So on this next slide, I've taken an infographic from the OECD. Now, the OECD has a due diligence guidance for minerals that are sourced from conflict areas, and this is currently the only internationally recognized framework. So this is what is used by companies to make to produce their conflict minerals report. And you can see from the infographic there's actually it's a 5-step process, and the side of the infographic that's useful to companies, those who are producing products, is on the right hand side in purple. So this is the downstream supply chain. So you might just be able to see that the first step is that a company must have strong company management systems. So that's about having a conflict minerals sourcing policy in place and having the systems in order to ensure that that policy is implemented and communicated. The second step of the due diligence framework is about identifying and assessing risks. So that is about identifying whether you've got tin, tantalum, tungsten or gold in your products, and then tracing the use of these back to the smelters. And when you assess that risk, you're basically assessing risk on the information that you receive back. The third step is about management of those risks. And that is, what do you do once you've carried out this risk assessment? Now, you can choose to disengage from smelters that are sourcing irresponsibly, or, which is preferable, the idea is that you work with them to encourage them to adopt these responsible practices. The fourth phase of the due diligence is about smelter and refiner audit. So making sure that the smelters and refiners who produce the metals from the minerals have actually got due diligence practices in place themselves. And the fifth step is about public disclosure of the due diligence that you've undertaken. And you can do that on your website, but also with the SEC filings, you're obviously submitting to the SEC and those reports are publicly available. Now, just remember that this due diligence guidance is only, or the framework and the requirement to implement it, is only required by the SEC rule if you're sourcing minerals from the DRC or adjoining countries. So just to recap, the current obligations of the SEC rules are about conducting a reasonable country of origin inquiry and filing the Form SD, and if applicable, conducting due diligence and producing conflict minerals reports. Now, some of you might have noticed that I had an infographic on the previous slide, flowchart, that showed the final rule requirements as they were published. And actually, not all those requirements are in effect right now. And the reason why they haven't, I haven't discussed them and they're not in effect, is that they've actually been subject to intense litigation. So the SEC is not required you to fulfill those requirements. And I just want to update you on the outcome of the due diligence now. So this is all hot off the press. Just to state what the litigation has been centred around. The final rule actually included a requirement to declare products as either DRC conflict-free, not being found to be DRC conflict-free, or DRC conflict undeterminable. But this was challenged on grounds that it breached the First Amendment. And a Court of Appeals decision back in 2014 that actually resulted in the SEC issuing a statement saying that you wouldn't have to disclose that information. They also stated that an independent audit report wouldn't be required unless a company voluntarily elected to describe its products as conflict-free. Now, the litigation has been going on for a long time, but earlier this week it actually came to a close, and a final court judgment has deemed it unlawful to require a company to report to the SEC and state on their website that the product has not been found to be conflict-free. So just to reiterate again, the current situation is that companies have to follow this earlier guidance from 2014. They have to submit their filings by the 31st of May, and those filings will involve submitting Form SD and a conflict minerals report if appropriate, but no statement on conflict-free status is going to be required. So as you can imagine, with this litigation finally over, we can expect some changes in the SEC rules. And there's actually been quite a lot of activity that suggests some changes are on the way. I just want to update you on those developments. So last year, the US House of Representatives passed a bill to well, it actually included a provision to defund the implementation or enforcement of the SEC's conflict minerals rules. The SEC hasn't been active in enforcement of them, but this would be an additional weakening of the SEC's powers. There was also another proposed act in 2016 that provided for the repeal of the conflict minerals section of the Dodd-Frank Act, the act that requires the SEC to promulgate rules. And it is expected that revisions to this act might include that, that provision as well. Now, some of you may have seen in the media about, or in February this year, some very potentially significant news. It was in the form of a leaked memorandum that was circulated stating that the US president was about to suspend the conflict minerals reporting rule, and he was going to do that on national security grounds. But that hasn't actually happened. What has happened, however, is that the SEC has held a public consultation on whether the burden of the legislation could be reduced. So they were asking about whether revisions to the guidance were appropriate, but they also wanted more general submissions from the public on their opinions of the legislation. And there have been around 300 comments, so a lot of interest. And these comments are actually mixed. So there's some organisations who are expressing support for the current requirements, some requesting additional requirements, for example, in respect of cobalt being identified as a conflict mineral. And there's also been people who are wanting this legislative burden to be removed. We can expect some sort of announcement following that consultation, which ended last month. What is clear, however, is that the US President is very keen that US corporations are not going to experience more legislative burden than foreign companies. So we can expect some changes to occur following the review of these responses. Now, what these changes will probably consider is developments that are happening in the EU. So I now want to just update you on what's going on there. So the legislative process to establish obligations for reporting and due diligence on conflict minerals is almost complete in the EU. There's been a lot of activity recently. So what does this EU legislation require? Well, the legislation requires importers of tin, tantalum, tungsten and gold, so the same metals as for the SEC reporting rules, to carry out due diligence consistent with the OECD framework. Crucial difference is that they're not focusing simply on the DRC and adjoining countries, but they will look at the origin of the metals worldwide. And there will also be exemptions for small importers and also minerals from recycled sources. The legislation is also going to require public reporting, including on the internet, and it will have to be done on an annual basis. And that reporting will include reporting on the company's supply chain policies and practices for its responsible sourcing. And that will include looking at its management system, its risk assessment and management, and also it will require a summary report of third-party audits. Now, another difference with the to the SEC rules is that reporting by downstream users of these minerals, so companies who use the minerals in their products, is not going to be mandatory. However, reporting is very much encouraged and referenced in the legislation, and it does require importers to communicate any due diligence information gathered to its downstream purchasers. So that's what the legislation requires. When is it going to take effect? Well, the exact date is not yet known, but what we do know is that on the 3rd of April, which just this week, this legislation was formally approved by the EU Council, and that's actually the penultimate phase for the law to become finalised. It will be finalised once it's been published in the European Union's official journal, and we can expect that that will occur probably in the next few weeks. The requirements on importers will apply from the 1st of January 2021. So that will actually give time for importers to prepare for the legislation and it will also allow the Commission and any competent authorities of the Member States to be established and to set up the enforcement regime. So the expansion into Europe is actually going to provide an additional driver for companies to undertake due diligence. Although the reporting requirements aren't mandatory, there is scope for review within the legislation, and companies are likely to face additional pressure from their stakeholders to conduct due diligence. And on this slide, I just wanted to talk about what the key challenges are for companies in implementing due diligence. And you'll recognise some of these aspects from the OECD framework. So firstly, you're going to have to identify whether any minerals in your products contain these conflict minerals. You then have to be able to trace them back to the source smelter or refiner. And the consequence of that is that is likely to involve contacting a lot of different suppliers up multiple tiers in the supply chain to get that information. And then obviously you'll have the burden of quality control and management. So that obviously is a significant resource requirement. Now, fortunately, a program has been developed by the EICC, which is the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition, and that will actually enable this resource requirement for an individual company to be reduced. So the IECC has developed the Conflict-Free Smelter Program. And this program identifies smelters that have responsible procurement practices. You might remember that the OECD framework includes smelter refiner audits, and that is what this program is effectively doing. So if you can trace your minerals back to the listed smelters in the program, then the burden of your due diligence is going to be reduced. Now, in order to carry out this traceability, the program has developed what's called the Conflict Minerals Reporting Template, and you can see that on the right-hand side of your screen there. So that is used to transfer information regarding the origin of minerals and the smelters used to process those minerals through the supply chain. And this template is the industry standard to use. And companies are using these forms for their country of origin inquiries and for their risk assessment activities, as well as reducing the burden of the smelter and refiner audit that's needed as part of the due diligence requirement. Just like to stress that it's very important that you always use the latest version of the form, because this will keep the list of smelters that are deemed conflict-free up to date. The current version, as you can see, is 4.20, but as of about an hour ago, it hadn't yet been updated, but we can expect a new version to be released later this month. And I've just included a link to the form there. So I hope that's giving you a useful update on the legislation, the changes that have occurred, and the due diligence requirement that's required for the SEC rules, but also will be developed for the EU rules as well. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Anthony, who's also from Compliance Map, and he'll explain how the conflict minerals reporting template is being used to gather and manage data, and he'll also discuss the solutions to the challenges I've identified in terms of the data of due diligence and reporting. So Anthony, over to you.
Thank you, Anne, and hello everybody. So as Anne described, what I'll be doing is just taking a few brief moments to discuss the practical challenges of managing your conflict mineral status and obligations, but also critically reviewing how both SiliconExpert and Compliance Map can actually help automate many of the tasks involved, in particular in managing the due diligence aspect of dealing with conflict minerals. So what I'm going to first do is just explain a little bit about the background of the challenges. And as Anne described, through the use of the CMRT, it does very much help standardize communication and the act of requesting and tracking responses and validating responses. But the whole process can still be rather daunting. So at quite a high level, there are two significant challenges. That of course, the reasonable country of origin inquiry, and the other one of essentially tracking, validating your conflict mineral status, evaluation and reporting. So with regards to the challenges of the data, of information gathering, you would have already likely encountered many of these items before. So for example, dealing with non-responses from your supply chain, receiving either bad or partial data responses, tracking escalations and issues, and following up with red flags, and so on and so forth. So it can be rather difficult, even with standardized communication templates and industry standard reports, to be able to manage the influx of information you have to gather from your supply chain and essentially validate the responses are accurate and conform to your requests. Now, of course, on the other side of the coin, the challenges of validating your conflict mineral status and essentially reporting to your customers, which is a significant part of this, can also be rather daunting, in so much as how do you, for instance, easily identify specifically which products do indeed contain conflict minerals or have smelters which are not deemed conflict-free? How do you deal with any of the data inconsistencies that might crop up, or in fact where you have non-responses or data gaps? How do you actually build an outbound CMRT for your customers, particularly if you're looking to build a product level declaration as opposed to a corporate company-wide declaration? So there are very much many different challenges on both sides of the spectrum that need to be dealt with in a way that helps to alleviate the burden that it places on yourselves and can very much be automated. So really, how does, therefore, the likes of SiliconExpert and Compliance Map help in this regard? How can we actually help to automate some of those tasks and, of course, make it rather straightforward to manage both data collection and ultimately the reporting of this information? Well, first off, SiliconExpert offers a complete database of over 400 million parts with information on conflict minerals, with capabilities to collect further information and custom part data that really will help to automate, bringing that information into a standardized solution that can then be used for validation, reporting purposes, which in this case you can see down the bottom is actually the Compliance Map management system. So of course, once this information is gathered from supply chain, once SiliconExpert brings all this information through and collects all of this, really does all the legwork, then what the Compliance Map system allows you to do is to analyze all the supply responses to, in essence, roll up the smelter validation and presence of conflict minerals, as well as to finally build customer reports and responses. So for instance, outbound CMRTs as a good example, and other types of reports. So the idea behind this is that it's meant to really alleviate the burden of data transport, of data creation, of building all the required responses that you'll likely will have to do throughout the life cycle of managing conflict minerals. Now, one of the things to emphasize here, of course, is that what we try and do is to ensure that all the data exchange communication is automated, including that of course, your list of suppliers, your bill of materials, AVL. So all of this has to, of course, come through into this process so that the right suppliers are contacted and, of course, the right data is integrated into being able to produce outbound CMRT documents. And that's what these solutions do, is that's what Compliance Map and SiliconExpert does, is to have this holistic enterprise-wide integrated setup so that it's all communicated automatically between the solutions and does alleviate that burden I mentioned of data transport. So to try and put this into context, what I'd like to do is actually use a practical example to illustrate what the steps would involve and how it would actually work from a practical standpoint. So to do that, I've got up here an example USB flash drive listed here in a bill of material view to give you an example. So you can see this is a rather simplistic view, a rather simplistic example that we have. You can see on the left-hand side we have 4 different main assemblies or items of the flash drive, and on the right-hand side you can see the actual part numbers involved, and there's the fact that we also have multiple suppliers for some of these parts. So we have multiple vendors that would be sourcing some of these parts, and the objective, therefore, in this instance, is to go ahead and actually get and collect the required information to conform to our reasonable country of origin inquiry obligations, and to then validate the responses and ultimately build out responses that our customers are requesting from us. So really that's the objective of this, and essentially what we would be doing, therefore, is you have your list of suppliers that we saw from the bill of material view. SiliconExpert automatically takes that information and actually matches it against its database. If there's no match, collects it from the supply chain and delivers the likes of a CMRT document or other industry standard document that communicates conflict minerals, like the IPC, for instance, or a simple declaration as well. Any documentation that helps to demonstrate the status of conflict minerals. Now, what then happens is this information flows through into the compliance map management system, where all the bill of materials from your ERP and PLM is merged together with supplier data, is automatically validated and rolled up to essentially create that product level view and supply level view, showing you whether there are any non-conflict free smelters present, whether there are any conflict minerals present in your products, so that you can be in a position to start, well, producing outbound reports and declarations. So that whole flow of information is completely automated. So again, helping to reduce that burden of information gathering and data validation and managing the whole due diligence aspect of the data itself. So once you actually have that information, this is the kind of view, therefore, that you can expect to get back. You can see it's the same view we had earlier in a couple of slides. This time it shows us the actual responses that have been received back against some of these records. So you can see that some of the suppliers have responded with some types of documents like the CMRT. Other suppliers have responded back with other types of documents. And the whole solution has therefore been able to validate and roll up the smelter validity and compliance against the CFSI lists. So once all this information is there, what do you then do? What's the next step? Well, the next step is really to respond to customers by creating, for instance, a CMRT, or if you're in a position that you have to report a Form SD. And so what happens is there are rules in place to help govern how to take the information for specific products, or indeed at a company level, to parse through and populate the outbound documents with regards to the smelter lists, product lists, and of course the actual declaration itself. So again, that's one less burden that is taken off your shoulders in terms of the management of this from a manual point of view, because this entire task is automated. Now, what else, therefore, would be the next step here? Well, you would also be looking to generate not just outbound CMRTs, but also analysis on, for instance, any presence of illegitimate smelters, data quality issues, performance metrics, and other types of analytics. So really trying to not just be reactive on managing conflict minerals, but trying to put yourself in a position where you're becoming proactive in managing this entire process. So just to summarize, therefore, the whole purpose really of the entire combined solution is very much to automate end-to-end, not just the data gathering and the outbound reporting aspects of managing conflict minerals, but really to be centered to how you manage your due diligence of conflict minerals. So whether it is in relation to the original country of origin validation, all the way to assessing whether you indeed have any of the minerals present within your bill of materials, to validating all the documentation, so that eventually you're in a position where you do have this entire audit trail that you can use to demonstrate what it is that you've done and accomplished with regards to data collection, data distribution, to be able to manage your obligations. And just as a final mention, the whole point of this solution again is to present to you an automated system, and as such the whole burden of managing updates to, for instance, the CMRT lists, updates to the CFS lists, the conflict-free smelter lists, is all on us, so that essentially you always have the most up-to-date information, up-to-date documentation to comply and respond to your customers. So that's just a very brief rundown at a very high level of our solution offering. So I hope that's been rather useful in giving you a glimpse of how we do help companies in managing many of the processes that Anne mentioned earlier in the presentation. What I'd like to do now is just hand it back to Laura and really try and help answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Anthony and Anne. So as Anthony mentioned, now we will open up the floor to allow for any questions. Again, just a reminder to please submit your questions through the control panel, the GoToWebinar control panel. So it looks like we already have a couple of questions. We also have on the line today Katie Hope and John Masterpietro from SiliconExpert. So Katie or John, this question might be for you. What if a supplier is not in SiliconExpert's database?
Hi, Laura. It's Katie. I can take that one for you. If a supplier is not in SiliconExpert's database, there is the opportunity to ask SiliconExpert to add that supplier, and we add any part to our database that is a public part with an orderable part number, and the supplier is able to give us a data sheet and the supporting documents that we need.
Okay, thank you. And I actually have another question for you, Katie. Does our database provide information on solder supplier part numbers?
Laura, can you repeat, please?
Sure. The question is, does our database, the SiliconExpert, provide data on the solder suppliers that are providing solder paste and other materials? They supply part numbers. Do we have that information?
Any part that's added to our database follows the same constraint on why or how we can add it. It needs to be a public orderable part number, and the supplier needs to be able to provide us a data sheet. So if it's solder that can be ordered by company A and company B, it has one orderable part number, and that supplier will provide us the data. We will add that part to our database.
Thanks, Katie.
If it's customer build to print, then it would not fall into the realm of the data in our database.
Okay, thank you. A question about China. Is China planning a conflict minerals legislation that you know of, Anne?
Yeah, well, there is actually quite a lot of discussion in China at the moment. Chinese authorities were involved in the OECD framework. There's nothing mandatory at the moment, but the idea is that definitely a voluntary standard will come out in China too. Legislation, as I mentioned, is only enacted at the moment in the US. So that's for companies reporting to the SEC rules. But also there's been some action at state level that requires the states, the individual states, to only do business with companies who are compliant with those SEC rules. So China's coming, I think.
Thanks, Anne. Okay, the next question is around the tool integration. Is there a tool from SiliconExpert or a compliance map that can be leveraged for gathering the part list details outside of Excel templates?
Hi, it's Anthony. I can probably help answer part of this. So really you're not limited to just using Excel templates with regards to information gathering. And the whole point of obviously our solution is to try and automate information gathering and transport of data. So you can really leverage any type of format for gathering part information and any other really industry standard formats as well. I named one earlier, which is, for instance, the IPC. They have their own in the 7050X family, which can be used to exchange information. So that's something which is natively supported within our solution. So that's something which can be done within the tool set within the platform.
Great, thank you, Anthony. Question about SiliconExpert. Are we planning to add all materials to the database or just conflict minerals? Reach needs all material content. Katie,
this is Katie. Yes. When we have all the environmental supporting documentation for a particular part, we do have chemical information on a part. We will gather full material declaration sheets. We do have all the other information, or can obtain all the other information that's required for various reporting purposes for different directives in legislation.
Okay, great. Anne, this might be for you. If the supplier provides a CMRT with smelter names and ID, but not the mine location, how do we handle RCOI?
The return country of origin. Well, if you can trace the mineral back to a conflict-free smelter, then that would fulfill the requirements. So what you would disclose is you disclose what you've actually done, which has been to send out the CMRT, but that you haven't gone further than that for the mine of origin, but you know that you're because you've participated in this program, you know that it's conflict-free. So that would be, you basically describe what you've done and what can be reasonably expected.
Great. Another quick question for you, Anne. Does conflict minerals only apply to publicly traded companies?
The legislative requirement applies to everyone, to only the people who report under the Exchange Act. So yes, they will be publicly traded.
Laura, I'd like to add to that a bit. While it is only the publicly traded companies that are required to file Form SD, in order to conduct their due diligence, they go downstream to their suppliers who, in fact, may be private, and they require this information. That private company has the, they have the right to say, I am not subject to this, but it will put them into a less competitive or less favorable position with their customers. So the private companies are adhering to this to maintain their position of standing with their customers.
Thanks, Katie and Anne. So a quick question on the package or the integration with Compliance Map and SiliconExpert. The question is around, is this a standard product or offering of SiliconExpert and or Compliance Map? Maybe Anthony, you can explain that integration and that product.
Yes, it is very much standard. So really, it's the SiliconExpert offering is very much the data gathering, information gathering component of that offering. And the Compliance Map portion revolves around the due diligence analysis, roll-up and reporting aspect of that process. And so obviously the holistic solution involves the end-to-end management of the information and due diligence and the management of the regulations. So it's very much there to help to automate from one end of the spectrum to the other, the requirements and burden that it places on you.
Okay, great. And how does Compliance Map deal with CMRTs or conflict mineral data in general that are several years old?
So that's it's not very good if there are declarations that are that old in a system. But the way that Compliance Map works in that sense is that really to do with any evidence documentation, the age of the documentation is tracked in such a way that it does contribute towards your risk rating. So that's one of the things which we haven't really discussed thus far in this presentation, but you do have risk-based roll-up information that does assess information like the age of the documentation, and that obviously will have an impact upon the quality of the information that you're able to produce in outbound reports. So the system will always inform you about, for instance, refreshing the data, for instance, on an annual basis, and providing you with campaigns to link to SiliconExpert in order to accomplish that, and other mechanisms as well to help manage the age of the data. But there is risk information that helps to alert you on that. So data which is several years old, that's not very good.
And Laura, I think for our audience, it's important to know that SiliconExpert has a web-based solution that allows them via our ticket system to request updated documentation on any supporting document that they may need, and we will go obtain the most current for that particular user. That data then becomes available in our database, and when the compliance map pings SiliconExpert, they'll now be pulling more current data. So it can be self-maintained through our web-based solution as well.
Okay, great. That kind of answers another one of our questions that we have here about what if a supplier doesn't provide everything that they need? So they would use the ticket system as well to alert SiliconExpert to go to seek that information?
Yes, so imagine that SiliconExpert has, a standalone web-based solution by which you can manage the data collection, the currency, and the accuracy of the data by utilizing our data team, which will then contact suppliers and get all the information required. Once your data is robust within the SiliconExpert database, then whatever compliance map pulls through is only going to be more comprehensive and accurate.
Okay, and is there a hard date by which we require suppliers to submit their CMRTs to us?
So if this is an OEM asking their suppliers to submit to them, that is something that's part of their process in determining how soon they need that before they can put together their own Form SD for submitting to EDGAR. So that would be a hard date that they impose on their suppliers to get that information by.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just reading the next questions we have here. So this individual gets a single report on conflict-free status for many parts, but not quite sure if they get consolidated reports that states the whole status of a bomb based on that report template shown. Is such a report planned to integrate with SiliconExpert? I'm guessing the question is a consolidated report of the entire bomb status is planned to integrate with SiliconExpert.
So Laura, the reports you can pull out of SiliconExpert specifically will be reports for any part that's in our database. And as I had noted earlier, that will be only public parts. So if we're talking about a complete bill of materials that includes custom sheet metal or other custom components within that end article, then that at that point would not be a complete report. I do believe, and Anthony, if you can speak to this further, that the compliance map can pull information that the end user compiles into the tool to merge the two. But please, if you would speak to that.
Yes, so that is correct. So you really have the feeds at the part level. So of all the electronic part information would flow through into compliance map, which would have your BOM view that then would allow you to analyze and view the conflict mineral status, conflict-free status in that BOM view, in that supplier view within the CMAP tool. Any missing pieces there, such as with custom part information, for instance, sheet metal and the likes, that can be requested through automatically through a campaign, leveraging email workflows and portals in order to gather that information. So you have options as far as filling in any missing gaps and getting that completed view, which would all be compiled within the compliance map tool for reporting purposes at that point.
Okay.
And I would suggest for those users that, or those attendees that have these sorts of questions, to invite you to request a demo. It becomes very clear when you see the visual through the demo.
Okay, so just a couple more questions that we can get to really quickly. I do want to reassure everyone that this recording, this webinar is being recorded, and I will be sending out a follow-up email containing not only the recording but also our slide deck, and the recording will contain the Q&A portion, as well as I will be putting together a document with all the questions and answers kind of in a PDF format for you to review as well, including any unanswered questions. So just a couple more we have time for. And just a quick clarification, we want to make sure they heard you correctly that China is building conflict mineral rules around the SEC rules. That's the U.S. SEC, correct?
No, they will be considering the OECD guidance for their conflict minerals report, but for their conflict minerals legislation. But it's that the OECD framework is in effect what's been used for both the US and the EU legislation. The OECD guidance is in effect the international standard for due diligence. So any legislation that comes out in any jurisdiction will be based on that.
Okay, great. And I'm going to open this question up to the floor. I'm not sure who the best one to answer is, but what responsibility do distributors have to provide conflict mineral information for all the products that they sell?
So they would fall much into the same category as a private company. It's not mandated. It all boils down to your standing with your customer and what position you want to maintain from a competitive and a relationship perspective. So if a distributor wants to take the effort to go try to obtain that from the suppliers of the components that they're providing to that particular customer, that will only help their customer and help their standing with that, but they are not mandated.
Okay. And then another clarifying question here. The features being discussed, is that something that needs to be purchased, or is it part of an existing BOM manager license?
Can you state the question again, please?
Sure. They just want to understand is the feature of what we discussed today, the integration with Compliance Map, is that something that they need to purchase, or is it an existing feature of their BOM manager license?
Yeah, the SiliconExpert web-based BOM manager license is a standalone product. It's web-based. The features in the products that we're discussing today are an integrated solution between SiliconExpert and the Compliance Map, and the information is all transmitted and gathered via API. So it's an integrated solution, not web-based.
and that is a different product that would be purchased.
Okay. All right. Thanks, John and Katie, for that final question. So that's all the time that we have today. I do encourage everyone, if you would like to see more and have more questions answered, to request a demo. That can be done through the SiliconExpert.com website or the ComplianceMap.com website. So again, thank you to our speakers, Ann and Anthony, and Katie and John, for answering questions. And I hope that everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you so much.